It's 1983, and deep within the corridors of Australian military power, men in uniform are passing state secrets to Moscow. Not one or two rogue officers, not a handful of compromised personnel. 150 operatives, embedded, waiting, ready to strike. This is not a Hollywood thriller. This is the true story of the greatest counterintelligence operation in Australian history, and the most unlikely hero who made it possible. Before we dive into this incredible tale, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and whether you've ever heard about Australia's hidden Cold War. Now, you might think you know how spy stories go: the dashing agent, the dramatic confrontation, the last-minute save. But what I'm about to tell you will shatter every assumption you have about heroes, about intelligence work, and about what it truly means to see what others refuse to believe. Because this story doesn't begin with a decorated officer or a seasoned field agent. It begins with a woman so unremarkable in appearance, so quiet in demeanor, so easily dismissed that she became invisible, and that invisibility became the Soviet Union's greatest nightmare. Her name was Margaret Chen, though that's not the name she was born with. And when she walked into ASIO headquarters in 1979, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing glasses that seemed too large for her face, absolutely no one suspected that this unassuming analyst would become the architect of the most devastating blow to Soviet intelligence operations in the Southern Hemisphere. The importance of what I'm about to tell you cannot be overstated. While the world focused on Berlin, on Moscow, on Washington, a silent war was being waged in the waters and air bases of Australia. A war that nearly cost the Western Alliance its strategic foothold in the Pacific. A war that was won not by military might, but by one woman's refusal to be silenced. Margaret Chen arrived at ASIO with credentials that told only part of her story. Born in Shanghai in 1943, she'd fled with her family during the Communist Revolution, spending her childhood in refugee camps before settling in Melbourne. She'd learned 6 languages by the time she was 15, not from formal education but from survival, from listening, from adapting. She'd worked her way through university as a night cleaner, earned degrees in linguistics and mathematics, and developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns where others saw only noise. But none of that was in her personnel file. What was in her file was Chinese immigrant, female, quiet, unremarkable. Her first act at ASIO was to do something that, on the surface, seemed mundane. She requested access to communication intercepts from Soviet diplomatic channels that had been marked as routine and filed away. But what Margaret saw in those routine messages was anything but ordinary. Embedded in seemingly innocent cultural exchange communications were microdot references, timing codes, and number sequences that matched known KGB operational patterns. She spent 6 months cross-referencing these patterns with personnel movements in the Australian Defence Force. 6 months of working 12-hour days, of sacrificing sleep, of filling notebooks with connections that formed a web so intricate and so terrifying that when she finally presented it to her superiors, the system she was about to expose went far beyond protocol. It shattered the comfortable illusion of safety that had defined Australian intelligence for decades. But here's where our story takes its first dramatic turn. Because when Margaret Chen walked into that conference room in March 1985, carrying boxes of evidence, prepared to present findings that suggested the largest infiltration of Australian defence infrastructure in history, she was met not with alarm, but with dismissal. Not with urgency, but with contempt. The conference room was packed. Senior intelligence, officers, military brass, defence officials, and sitting at the head of the table was Deputy Director James Thornton, a man whose career had been built on Cold War paranoia, but who had grown comfortable in his position, skeptical of what he called analyst hysteria. Thornton was everything Margaret was not: tall, commanding, educated at Oxford, a veteran of MI6 exchanges, a man who believed intelligence work was about big plays and dramatic defections, not about number crunching and immigrant intuition, as he'd once dismissively said. Margaret began her presentation. She detailed the intercepts. She showed the patterns. She mapped the connections between Soviet cultural attachés and Australian Defence Force personnel. She demonstrated how seemingly random social events, academic conferences, and sporting clubs were being used as recruitment and dead-drop venues. She explained how the KGB had spent nearly a decade building a network that now had tendrils in radar operations, naval, communications, and air defense systems. The silence in the room should have been one of shock. Instead, it was one of barely concealed mockery. Thornton leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing at his lips. "Miss Chen," he said, emphasizing the miss with deliberate condescension, "this is ASIO. not a conspiracy theory convention. You're suggesting that 150 members of our defense force are Soviet agents? Based on what? Number patterns? Social connections? By that logic, half of Canberra is working for Moscow. Laughter rippled through the room. Not kind laughter. Cruel laughter. Colonel Richard Hewitt, a decorated military intelligence officer known for his blunt manner and even blunter prejudices, leaned forward. With all due respect, Thornton, I'm not sure why we're wasting time on this. Chen's been with us, what, 5 years? And she's spent most of that time in the archives. When has an analyst, much less one with no field experience, no military background, uncovered something of this magnitude? This isn't about patterns. This is about understanding operational reality. Something that requires more than... He paused, his eyes scanning Margaret with barely veiled disdain. Academic exercises. Margaret remained absolutely still. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. Almost eerily calm. Colonel Hewitt, with respect, operational reality is built on intelligence. And intelligence is built on patterns. The Soviets have... The Soviets, interrupted a third voice, this one belonging to Defense Liaison Martin Cross. A man whose political ambitions were poorly hidden, are a threat we've been managing for 40 years. We have protocols, we have vetting, we have security clearances that go through multiple levels. Are you suggesting our entire system is compromised? That's quite an accusation, especially coming from someone who, he glanced at her file, isn't even native-born. The air in the room shifted. The prejudice that had been lurking beneath professional dismissal now surfaced, raw and ugly. Margaret's hands resting on the table didn't tremble, but those watching closely might have noticed the slight whitening of her knuckles. My birthplace, she said quietly, has nothing to do with the evidence. The intercepts are real. The patterns are statistically significant. The risk is... The risk, Thornton cut in, standing now, his voice hardening with authority, is that we chase ghosts based on the paranoid interpretations of an overzealous analyst and cause an international incident, destroy careers, and make ourselves look like fools. Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but intelligence work requires judgment, experience, and frankly, a better understanding of how the world actually works. This presentation is over. I'm recommending your findings be marked as speculative and filed. If you continue to push this narrative without concrete evidence, and by concrete I mean a confession, a defection, or a smoking gun, you'll find yourself reassigned to considerably less sensitive work. The threat hung in the air like a blade. Margaret gathered her papers slowly. The boxes of evidence she'd brought remained unopened. As she left the room, she could hear the resumed conversation behind her, the dismissive tones, the relieved laughter of men who dodged what they saw as bureaucratic inconvenience. She could hear Colonel Hewitt saying, "Always the immigrants, isn't it? So eager to prove their loyalty they see enemies everywhere." But what none of them saw was the resolve hardening in Margaret Chen's eyes. What none of them understood was that dismissal, discrimination, and doubt had been the texture of her entire life. And she had learned long ago that the most powerful thing an underestimated person possesses is the freedom to work beneath notice. For the next 8 months, Margaret operated in the shadows of ASIO. She didn't stop her investigation. She simply stopped. Asking for permission. She used her access to archives to pull older files, cross-referencing Soviet intelligence methods from the 50s and 60s with current ADF personnel records. She cultivated relationships with junior analysts who believed her, building a quiet network of support. She began conducting her own surveillance during her off hours, photographing social gatherings, documenting meetings, building a visual timeline of connections. But she also did something else. Something that showed the depth of her strategic mind. She reached out, through carefully coded personal advertisements in newspapers, and through a network of Cold War refugees she'd maintained contact with since her own escape from China, to a Soviet intelligence officer she suspected was having doubts. His code name, she'd learned through intercepts, was Volkov. His real name was Alexei Dimitrov, and he was a KGB handler operating under diplomatic cover in the Soviet embassy. The tension building during these months was excruciating. Margaret knew that every day she delayed was another day the network could be activated. Every day that Thornton and his allies dismissed her warnings was another day Australian secrets could be flowing to Moscow. She lost weight. She stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. Her colleagues noticed she'd become even quieter, even more withdrawn. What they didn't notice was that she was methodically, brilliantly building an ironclad case. Meanwhile, James Thornton was riding high. He'd recently overseen a successful counterintelligence operation against a minor Soviet trade official, earning commendations and positioning himself for the director role. He'd all but forgotten about Margaret Chen's fantasy infiltration scenario, as he now called it, at dinner parties. He'd become comfortable again, convinced of his own expertise, surrounded by allies who confirmed his worldview. Colonel Hewitt had gone further. He'd begun quietly lobbying for Margaret's dismissal, citing her as a security risk due to her obsessive behavior and foreign background. He'd gathered support from other senior officers who found her persistence annoying and her implications insulting. But then, in November 1985, three things happened in rapid succession that would change everything. First, Margaret made contact with Dimitrov. Their first meeting was in a public park, carefully orchestrated to look accidental. She spoke to him in Russian, perfect. Moscow accented Russian that surprised him. She didn't threaten him. She didn't try to recruit him. She simply told him about her childhood in Shanghai, about watching her father disappear during a purge, about learning that ideology destroys more lives than it saves. She asked him one question. Are you proud of what you're building here? Then she walked away. Second, one of the Soviet agents Margaret had identified, a junior radar technician named David Morrison, who had gambling debts and a drinking problem, attempted to pass classified information about a new American surveillance system to his handler. But the handler didn't show. Instead, Morrison found himself approached by two ASIO agents Margaret had secretly briefed, agents who believed her when the senior leadership didn't. Morrison, panicked and drunk, confessed. Not to everything, but to enough. Enough to confirm Margaret's pattern was real. Third, Alexei Dimitrov, tormented by Margaret's question and increasingly disillusioned with the KGB's methods, made a decision that would seal his fate and vindicate hers. He sent her a message through the same coded system she'd used to contact him. The message contained a single name. One of the highest-ranking KGB agents in the Australian network, someone so embedded, so trusted, so above suspicion that his exposure would validate everything Margaret had claimed. The name was Commander Jeffrey Walsh, ASIO's own liaison to military intelligence. Margaret's heart must have stopped when she decoded that message. Because Walsh wasn't just any officer. He was Thornton's close friend, his golf partner, his confidant, and he had been in that conference room when Margaret presented her findings. He had heard every name she'd flagged, every pattern she'd identified, and he'd had 8 months to warn the network, to cover tracks, to prepare countermeasures. But here's where Margaret's genius truly shone. She'd anticipated this possibility. The names she'd presented in that March meeting, they were real, but they were the outer layer of the network, the less critical operatives, the ones who could be sacrificed. The core names, the ones that mattered, the ones that included Walsh, she'd kept in encrypted notes only she could access. She'd used Thornton's dismissal as a shield, letting Walsh believe the threat had been neutralized. Now she had to act. Fast. And she couldn't go through official channels because Walsh would hear about it within hours. She made a decision that broke every protocol but followed a higher law. The law of survival. She contacted the Prime Minister's office directly, using a junior staffer she'd once helped with a research project. She sent a single-page memo marked Eyes Only National Security, with one sentence. ASIO has been compromised at the senior level. Request emergency private briefing with evidence of Soviet infiltration of ADF and intelligence services. 3 days later, Margaret Chen sat in a secure room in Parliament House with the Prime Minister, the Attorney General, and the Director General of ASIO, bypassed Thornton entirely. This time she brought everything. Morrison's confession, Dimitrov's intelligence, encrypted communications, photographs, financial records, surveillance footage, and most damning of all, evidence that Commander Walsh had been systematically feeding information about ASIO investigations to Soviet handlers for 7 years. The room was deathly silent as she presented. No mockery now. No dismissal. Just the growing horror of men realizing they'd been blind. But the confrontation Margaret had been building toward, the moment where truth would collide with arrogance and denial, was still to come. Because when the Prime Minister authorized an immediate, covert investigation based on Margaret's evidence, when teams of trusted agents were assembled to quietly surveil the identified suspects, when they decided to bring in Thornton and Walsh for questioning, the deputy director walked in with absolute confidence, still unaware that his world was about to implode. Thornton entered the ASIO director's office expecting a routine meeting. Instead, he found himself facing not just the director, but the Attorney General, Senior Federal Police, and sitting quietly in the corner, Margaret Chen. "What's this about?" Thornton demanded, his voice already defensive, sensing something wrong. James, the director said, his voice grave. We need to discuss Commander Walsh, and we need to discuss your relationship with him. Thornton's face flickered with confusion, then anger. Jeffrey, what does this have to do with… He stopped. His eyes landed on Margaret. What did you do? Margaret said nothing. She simply slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs of Walsh meeting with known Soviet intelligence officers, bank records showing payments from shell corporations traced to KGB funding, and most devastating, transcripts of intercepted communications between Walsh and his handlers, including references to T, providing information about ASIO's internal skepticism of Chinese analyst findings. The color drained from Thornton's face. This is impossible. Jeff would never… Commander Walsh has been detained, the director said quietly. He's confessed. He's been working for Soviet intelligence since 1978. And James? He's implicated you. What? Thornton's shout echoed in the small room. I have never compromised this organization. I've dedicated my life. No one is accusing you of treason, the Attorney General interjected. But you need to understand what your dismissal of Chen's investigation cost us. Walsh had access to her initial findings. He had 8 months to warn his network, to create cover stories, to prepare countermeasures. We're still assessing the damage. More critically, your public dismissal of Chen created a culture where questioning loyalty, where looking for patterns others missed, was seen as career suicide. How many other analysts saw pieces of this and stayed silent because they watched what happened to her? Thornton looked at Margaret. Really looked at her. Perhaps for the first time. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes. The weight of months of working alone, doubted, discriminated against, threatened. He saw the quiet strength it had taken to persist. And he saw something else. He saw his own reflection in her position and realized how easily he could have been her ally instead of her obstacle. He started, then stopped. The words wouldn't come. Pride and shame warred visibly on his face. Colonel Hewitt was brought in next, along with Martin Cross and 3 other senior officials who'd been in that March meeting. One by one they were shown the evidence. The network Margaret had identified, the names she'd flagged, the patterns she'd mapped, and David Morrison's confession, followed by Alexei Dimitrov's intelligence, followed by Walsh's. Exposure had created a cascade effect. Agents were being quietly arrested. Others were defecting, realizing the network was compromised. In total, over the next 6 months, 150 suspected Soviet intelligence operatives and recruited assets would be identified, surveilled, neutralized, or turned. 150, exactly as Margaret had estimated. The confrontation reached its peak when Hewitt, still defiant despite the evidence, turned on Margaret with venom. You should never have had access to this material in the first place. Someone with your background, your foreign birth… Colonel! Margaret's voice cut through the room like a blade. It was the first time many had heard her speak with force, with anger, with the full weight of her intelligence and experience behind it. My background is precisely why I could see what you couldn't. I know what totalitarianism looks like because I fled from it. I know what infiltration looks like because I survived it. I know what patterns of control and manipulation look like because I lived under them. You were taught about Soviet intelligence in classrooms and briefings. I learned about it by watching my family destroyed by it. The room was absolutely silent. The tension was palpable, every person holding their breath. Margaret continued, her voice steady now, controlled, but filled with an emotion that was impossible to ignore. You dismissed me because I was a woman, because I was Chinese, because I was quiet and didn't fit your image of what an intelligence officer should be. You let your prejudices, your arrogance, your comfortable assumptions blind you to the greatest security threat this nation has faced. And do you know what the truly terrifying part is? This happens every day, in every organization, in every system. We silence the people who see clearly because they don't look like us, don't speak like us, don't come from where we come from. And that blindness, that willing, comfortable blindness, is more dangerous than any enemy agent. Hewitt's face was red, but he said nothing. What could he say? Then Margaret did something unexpected. She stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out another folder. But here's what you also don't know about me, she said, and her voice shifted, becoming almost gentle. When I was 15, living in that refugee camp in Hong Kong, I taught myself English by listening to BBC radio broadcasts. I didn't just learn the language. I learned every announcer's voice, every speech pattern, every accent variation. I developed what my teacher called an impossible ear. That skill, that refugee survival skill, is what allowed me to detect anomalies in intercepted voice communications that your trained field agents missed. She pulled out another document. When I was 20, working as a night cleaner to pay for university, I discovered that the mathematics building where I worked was being used by a visiting Soviet academic who was actually an intelligence officer recruiting Australian students. I reported it to local police. They didn't believe me. I persisted. Eventually, ASIO investigated. They found I was right. That incident is in a classified file that none of you ever bothered to read when you dismissed me as unremarkable. The revelations kept coming, each one a hammer blow to the assumptions that had dominated that March meeting. When I was 25, I was recruited by Taiwan's intelligence service because of my language skills and my knowledge of communist Chinese operations. I turned them down because I'd chosen Australia as my home. And I don't serve two masters. But I maintained contact with their analysts. And through them, I learned that the KGB was running parallel infiltration operations in New Zealand, Singapore, and Australia. That's what gave me the framework to recognize the patterns here. She placed a final folder on the table. And here's something else you didn't know. Alexei Dimitrov, the Soviet intelligence officer whose information confirmed Walsh's identity, he didn't defect for money or immunity. He defected because I reminded him of his mother. She was a linguist who was purged during Stalin's terror. She died in a labor camp. When I told him about my father, when I spoke to him in perfect Russian, when I asked him if he was proud of what he was building, I wasn't just gathering intelligence. I was appealing to his humanity, something none of you thought to do. Because you see intelligence work as a game of tricks and power, not as a human endeavor where compassion and understanding can be strategic weapons. The room was in shock. This quiet, dismissed analyst had just revealed herself to be one of the most sophisticated intelligence operators in the country. And she'd done it all while being treated as incompetent and suspect. But Margaret wasn't finished. "There's one more thing," she said. And now her voice carried something different. Not anger, not pride, something softer, something that spoke to the heart of what had happened. When Commander Walsh confessed, he told interrogators something interesting. He said that he'd started working for the Soviets because he felt overlooked, undervalued, passed over for promotions he deserved. He said he was angry at a system that seemed arbitrary and unfair. He said he justified his treason by telling himself the people in power didn't deserve their positions anyway. She looked directly at Thornton, at Hewitt, at each of the men who'd dismissed her. Do you understand what I'm saying? Walsh's treason began with the same poison that almost let his network succeed. The belief that value is measured by appearance, by background, by conformity to expectation. The same system that elevated people like Walsh because they fit a profile, that dismissed people like me because we didn't, is the same system Walsh exploited. He knew you'd never suspect someone who looked right, sounded right,